Stolen valor! The woman's voice cracked through the lobby like a whip, drawing every eye in the government office toward counter 3. Her finger jabbed the air, her breath hot with fury, as she glared down at the old man standing opposite her. This ID is fake. You were never in the United States Army. You made this up. The man didn't speak. His weathered hands stayed still, one resting on the cane beside him, the other still lightly touching the ID card lying flat on the counter. The card had slid a little when she slapped it down, now tilted awkwardly, its photo gleaming beneath the sterile fluorescent lights. The black and white image showed a younger version of him. Square jaw, proud eyes, the faint outline of a Special Forces insignia, just visible on the collar. She leaned over the counter, her tone lowering but sharper now. You think just because you're old we won't check. People like you make a joke out of real service. Her voice had weight behind it, loud enough that a child in the lobby dropped a juice box and backed closer to his mother's legs. The tension in the room thickened, the silence pulling tight as a wire. The old man, dressed plainly in olive fatigues and a faded patrol cap, looked at her, then back to the ID. His face didn't redden, his fists didn't clench. Instead, his expression remained fixed, as if he'd stood in worse fire than this. He gently placed 2 fingers on the corner of the card to straighten it, as though honoring something sacred. Behind him, people began to shift in their seats. Not everyone agreed, but no one moved. A teenage boy near the water fountain pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up in his palm. No one noticed the man seated in the far back row, staring hard beneath the brim of a government-issued cap, fingers hovering over his badge. The clerk's final words landed like a hammer. "You're wasting government time, and I won't be lied to. You were never Commander Henry Collins." But she was wrong. And the call had already reached someone who remembered his voice from the other side of a war. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The lobby of the county services office smelled faintly of damp carpet and burnt coffee. Fluorescent tubes buzzed softly above cracked ceiling tiles, and the air hung with the quiet fatigue of bureaucracy, printers sighing, chairs squeaking, the occasional cough echoing across the linoleum floor. It was the first Monday of the month, just after opening, and the room was already full, a collage of folded arms, crossed legs, and downturned eyes waiting on a number to be called. Henry Collins, 79, always came early. Not to beat the line, but because punctuality had long outlived its necessity. It was habit, built from decades of knowing that 10 minutes early meant being exactly on time. He walked with a measured rhythm, his left leg a half-inch slower than the right. Each tap of his cane struck clean against the tile, like a metronome that no one else could hear. The floor beneath him creaked faintly in places, but he never looked down. He knew the path by memory, 23 steps from the double doors to the sign-in desk. He wore the same olive jacket every visit, military issue from another decade, pressed neatly despite the fraying cuffs. Beneath it, a plain gray button-up and slacks, creased but modest. The cap on his head bore no patch, no name, just the deep green of a past that didn't ask for recognition. In his left hand, tucked beneath the crook of his arm, he carried a manila folder, its corners softened from long handling, a rubber band wound tight across the middle. Between the folded flaps was a single transparent sleeve. Inside it, an old military ID card, its photo barely visible beneath a matte film of wear. He didn't need to be told where to go. Counter 3 was always the same clerk. Blonde bob, narrow glasses, voice like a stapler when she spoke. He nodded to her when their eyes met, but she did not return the gesture. Her lips pressed thin as he approached, one eyebrow rising not in welcome, but wariness. She watched the folder as he set it gently on the counter. The ID was placed separately, turned just so, the photograph facing her, not himself. Her sigh was loud enough for 3 people in line to glance up. "Old records again?" she muttered under her breath, though not quietly enough to be private. The woman behind him, early 50s, floral purse, frown lines like knives, leaned to whisper, "He's always here with that folder. Makes you wonder what he's trying to get." But Hank didn't react. He simply unhooked the rubber band, opening the folder as carefully as someone folding a flag. Inside, nothing chaotic. No loose pages or coffee stains, just order. Letters dated back to the 1970s, their print faded, edges browning. Military rosters with names printed in carbon, some names crossed out in pencil. A photograph of 8 men in jungle fatigues, smiling with the fatigue of survival. Another photo, this one black and white, showed him as a young man, rifle slung over shoulder, his face half-shadowed beneath a helmet. The clerk glanced down with narrowed eyes. She poked the ID with a pen. "This card is old. Regulations changed years ago. This doesn't meet updated format." Her voice was clipped, tone sharp enough to slice paper. She didn't reach for the folder, just sat back in her chair with crossed arms. "We need current documentation, real-time records." Hank nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. He reached into the folder again and produced another envelope. This one sealed, marked with a faded military crest. His hand trembled slightly as he slid it forward. The envelope bore a stamp from the Office of Discharged Records addressed to him. The ink had smudged slightly in the rain weeks ago, but the contents inside were pristine. She didn't touch it. "I asked for updated documentation, not dusty memorabilia," she snapped. A younger man, 2 seats away in the waiting room, chuckled behind a hand. "Probably just wants the discount," he whispered to his friend. Hank heard it. His ear didn't flinch, but his hand did pause on the envelope, only for a breath. Then he slowly retrieved it, placed it back in the folder, and closed it again. The rubber band went back around with care, a quiet ritual of dismissal. The clerk's eyes didn't soften. "We'll call you when we're ready. Please take a seat." Hank nodded, turned, and took the slow walk back toward the plastic chairs lining the far wall. Each step carried the weight of distance not measured in feet, but in years. His eyes stayed forward. His jaw held firm. As he passed by the whispering woman, she leaned away slightly, not out of fear, but distaste. He sat down in the last chair of the row, the one closest to the flag, American, folded poorly, crooked on the pole. The ID card remained on the counter, unattended. But further down the wall, in the last chair of the back row, a man shifted slightly. He had not taken a number, had not spoken, but his eyes, trained, calm, calculating, remained fixed on the scene. A small badge rested on his belt, half concealed beneath his sport coat, and in his pocket, his phone had just buzzed with a name, Commander Henry Collins. No one stood, yet. The air conditioning hissed against the narrow vents above the waiting area, giving a faint undertone of wind in a canyon, broken only by the occasional beep of a ticket machine and the scrape of rubber soles against the floor. Hank sat perfectly still, legs square, back firm against the plastic chair. His hands rested on the folder in his lap, thumbs gently crossed, as if guarding something sacred. Across from him, a child sat swinging his legs, seated next to a woman in scrubs who kept glancing at her watch. The boy squinted curiously at Hank's cane. It leaned against the armrest like a relic. Dark wood, rounded head, the initials HC, barely visible where the varnish had worn down. The boy's mouth opened as if to ask something, but his mother gently tugged him back toward her shoulder. Hank didn't notice. He was occupied, not with worry, but with method, with quiet repetition. He removed the rubber band again and opened the folder once more. Inside, he checked the sequence of documents: enlistment record, discharge certificate, letter from a now-defunct unit command, a yellowed sheet marked temporary orders, Alpha Group Recon. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, the same order every time. Folded corners smoothed, staples aligned, dates visible in the upper right. He retrieved the envelope again, the one from the Department of Defense, and ran his thumb beneath its edge. The paper was thin, worn from the friction of being opened and resealed dozens of times. His eyes scanned the typed lines, Not to read, but to reassure. His mouth moved slightly as if counting. Once, twice. From behind the glass, the same clerk watched through narrowed eyes. She muttered something toward her colleague at the next desk, a younger man with a headset, who gave a short laugh and whispered back. They both looked toward Hank. The younger one mimed a slow shuffle with his hands, mocking the rhythm of a cane. Further down the line, a woman in a crisp suit stepped up to the counter. She looked down at Hank's folder resting on the seat beside him and wrinkled her nose. "Are these seats reserved now?" she asked loudly. Hank glanced at her, then shifted the folder onto his lap without a word. She sat down in the newly cleared chair, crossing her legs sharply. The number on the screen clicked upward. 48. Hank was holding 52. From the back corner, Colonel Rivers hadn't moved. His phone sat silent in his palm now, face down. He watched the clerk call the next name. He saw Hank glance toward the counter again, the same hopeful glance of a man trying not to hope. Hank rose carefully when 49 was called. Not because it was his turn, but because standing was easier than looking idle. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, smoothed the hem of his shirt, walked 3 slow steps toward the drinking fountain. The machine sputtered with a tired growl, spitting lukewarm water into a cracked basin. Hank cupped his hand, drank without bending fully, his back stiff with caution, then wiped his chin with a cloth handkerchief folded in his breast pocket. A soft laughter carried from the clerk's desk. The young man in the headset had said something about ghost soldiers. The older clerk covered her mouth, chuckling behind her hand. Hank's return to his seat was slower than his walk away from it. The woman beside him had crossed her legs again, now brushing the edge of his shoe. She did not apologize. The moment he sat, the clerk's voice rang out again. "Number 50. A tall man with a phone pressed to his ear walked up, barely glancing at the waiting crowd. He handed over a license, took a clipboard, and walked away, done in under a minute. Hank stared forward still, his fingers now resting along the edge of the folder. His thumb slowly ran over the ID card, still warm from his pocket. "Old-timers always think their card makes them special," came a voice from the bench across from him, a man in a leather jacket, maybe early 40s, shaking his head toward a teenager beside him. "You think they digitize already," the boy muttered. Hank didn't blink. He didn't lower his eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, he opened the folder once more and removed a single photograph, the one where 8 young men stood in jungle brush, sweat soaked through their fatigues, dirt smeared across smiles that had seen too much. He stared at the photo for a moment, then folded it gently into the crease of his documents and returned it to the stack. The child nearby peeked again, his mother still tugging at her phone. And behind the glass, the clerk called 51. Hank's breath slowed. His fingers curled slightly on the edge of the chair. His ticket remained motionless beneath the folder. The light above the counter buzzed on and off, once, flickering like a bulb with second thoughts. From the corner, Colonel Rivers stood slowly, his eyes narrowing, and took a step forward. But this time the silence wasn't shame. It was anticipation. The buzzer chirped again. "Number 52, the clerk called out, her voice sterile and brisk. A pause. No warmth, no inflection. Just the hollow routine of repetition. Her eyes didn't lift from the monitor. She tapped her nails against the keyboard while chewing on a lip gloss-stained straw from an oversized soda. Hank Collins stood with effort, pressing both hands into the armrests before lifting with his cane. The room gave no acknowledgement. No head turned, no seat shifted. His right leg dragged slightly, not from pain but from memory. He crossed the stretch of linoleum floor, one deliberate step at a time, his breath shallow, but even. The clerk didn't hide her impatience. As Hank reached the counter, she sighed loudly, then looked past him toward the next ticket screen. Her tone was clipped. "Identification," she said without greeting. Hank nodded gently and unfolded his documents on the counter. Same sequence, same care. He placed his Department of Defense card down first, followed by his paper discharge notice, commendation letter, and the weathered photo that had begun to curl at the edges. The clerk glanced briefly, then frowned. She tapped at the monitor and leaned toward a co-worker. "There's no active file from 72 onward," she muttered, loud enough for the adjacent line to hear. The co-worker peered across the desk. "Alpha 5? He asked, scoffing. "That unit doesn't exist anymore." The clerk smirked and looked directly at Hank. "Sir," she said louder, "this ID is invalid. And if you're implying you served in Alpha 5 Recon, that's a problem. That file is sealed, or fake." There was a pause, a long one. The room grew a touch quieter, the buzz of conversation thinning like fog in sun. Hank didn't flinch. His hand hovered slightly above the edge of the counter. The lines on his face didn't shift, only deepened. He answered in a calm voice. "I served. I carried this card through 3 deployments. It's mine." The clerk tilted her head. "We don't go off stories. You're not listed in any post-71 activity. Your documents are incomplete, possibly fabricated." Behind Hank, someone in the crowd let out a short snort. Another whispered, "These old guys, always digging up ghost units." The co-worker picked up the military ID, held it by the corner like it might stain. "This even real?" he said to no one in particular. The tension cracked further when the clerk placed the ID back down, not carefully, but with the snap of fingernails against metal. The card skidded and spun. Hank reached to straighten it. A beat. Then the clerk spoke again, sharper now, almost performative. "If you cannot provide verifiable post-service logs, you'll be marked for administrative review. False military identification carries federal penalties." She paused for effect, then folded her arms. "You understand that, sir?" Hank's voice was low. "I understand what it means to be forgotten." The words didn't sting the clerk. They missed her completely. She scoffed and reached for the folder. One of the documents, the mission orders, slipped loose and fluttered to the floor. She didn't bend to retrieve it. From the bench near the corner, a man in a black ball cap stood. His voice was tentative, but firm. "He's not lying," he said. "That photo there," he pointed, "that's Tet offensive territory. I've seen that exact ridge. My uncle was there. That patch on his sleeve, that's real." The clerk whipped around. "Sir, this does not involve you. Return to your seat." The man hesitated, then sat back down. His face was pink, his mouth tight. Another older man near the vending machines grumbled, "Let it go, kid. It's not worth it." The clerk took a fresh form from a drawer, slapped it on the counter. "If you want to contest status, fill this out. Otherwise, you're holding up the line." Hank did not pick it up. Instead, he removed a photo from the bottom of the folder. This one smaller, black and white. A handshake between himself and a general. Date stamped, corner faded. He placed it down gently. The clerk didn't even glance. "This isn't the Hall of Honor," she said with finality. "We don't process nostalgia." Then, with a practiced flick, she slid the ID and photo toward the trash can next to her feet. The card didn't land inside. It hit the rim, clinked, and fell halfway in. The photo fluttered down beside it. The room went still. So still that the hum of the lights felt louder than the people. Hank's hand clenched slightly around the edge of the counter. For the first time, something in his jaw tightened. He stepped back slowly, eyes never leaving the clerk's face. From the corner, Colonel Rivers was already on his feet, moving not fast, but with the silent rhythm of a man walking into memory. The weight of war doesn't always live in the hands. Sometimes it lives in how still you can keep them. The hallway still echoed with the snap of the card against the trash rim. No one moved. The sound had left behind a hush that lingered in the corners like smoke. Even the ticket machine, which chirped out the next number, seemed embarrassed by its timing. No one stood to claim it. Hank took a single step back from the counter, then paused. His right hand rested lightly on the worn leather strap of the folder, while the left gripped the top of his cane. He didn't look down at the documents. He didn't plead for understanding. His eyes stayed locked on the clerk, not in challenge, but in clarity. The kind of stare that speaks of burial details and broken radios. The kind that doesn't blink because it already has. He turned, slowly. No grand motion, no theatrics. His steps were measured. Each one pulled the air with it. The kind of walking that used to mean something. Formation on gravel, early light through fog. With the cane clicking once, then again, he made his way toward the waste bin. His knees bent with resistance, bones quiet but full of old creaks. He crouched not to retrieve a thing, but to honor what it represented. His hand reached into the bin. 2 fingers, steady despite the moment, lifted the card first. He turned it, brushing the corner gently with his thumb where it had been scratched. Then the photograph. He tucked that beneath the card, like a memory shielding another. He stood, and with a single white handkerchief, folded into precise quarters, he wiped both clean. Not rushed, not shameful. Just the same way he'd cleaned a sidearm once, seated on the tailgate of a dusty vehicle in Laos, with care born of necessity, not sentimentality. When he returned to his seat, he did so with the same poise he had when he'd walked in. He didn't slump, he didn't sigh, he didn't glance to see who watched. He only took his place at the far end of the bench, reopening his folder, now slightly thinner, now cleaner than it had been moments ago. The cane rested gently against the side of his knee. His left hand, the one that had gripped it, remained resting atop the folder, not fidgeting. The right hand hovered slightly above the contents, as if to protect, but not display. He did not smooth the pages again. He didn't need to. Across from him, a teenage boy leaned forward in his chair. The boy's fingers twitched at the edge of his phone screen, uncertain whether to type or capture. But something in Hank's stillness stopped him. The camera never rose. The clerk resumed typing, not faster, not more careful, just mechanical. The document feeder whirred, but the room had lost its rhythm. Every sound was a reminder now. Near the rear security station, one of the guards adjusted his earpiece, glanced toward the waiting area, and then back at the clipboard in his hand. He said something quietly into the mic. The other guard didn't reply, just nodded once and stepped outside through the service door. A draft crept through the room a moment later. No one seemed to notice it, except Hank. His eyes lifted slightly, as though recognizing a shift not in the temperature, but in the atmosphere. His spine adjusted by a degree, his shoulders squaring, not to prepare, but to receive. Still, he didn't speak. The room moved around him in small, silent orbits. The next number was called. A woman with a stroller stood and walked to the window, casting a brief glance toward Hank before looking away again. A man near the entrance flipped a newspaper closed and placed it under his arm. The clerk didn't speak again, not to Hank, not to anyone. Her focus stayed on the screen, but her fingers missed more keys than they hit. On the far wall, a clock ticked once, then again, and at the back of the room, just beyond the partition wall, the sound of a leather boot heel landed against tile, not loudly, but with intent. Some uniforms are never removed. They just become part of the silence. At the far edge of the waiting room, in a row of beige government chairs that seemed designed more to test patience than offer comfort, a man shifted forward slightly. His elbows rested on his knees, hands loosely clasped, eyes fixed on the older gentleman across the room. He wore civilian clothes, a plain button-down tucked neatly into dark slacks, a weathered canvas jacket folded over one arm. But what stood out quietly was the subtle glint of a badge clipped to his inner belt, partially obscured by the drape of his coat. It wasn't police. It wasn't local government. The insignia bore the sharp wings of the Department of Defense, the Office of Personnel Integrity. Colonel Mark Rivers, retired, 47. 18 years of active duty, another 8 in sensitive intel. His presence was not accidental. He had arrived early that morning under the guise of a clerical audit. No one in the office had asked questions. His credentials opened doors, silenced chatter. He'd spent the first hour walking the perimeter, observing, listening. Now he sat back, seemingly just another quiet figure among the state-issued tiles and flickering fluorescent lights. But his eyes hadn't left Hank Collins since the folder first opened. He had seen the moment the clerk struck the ID. He had watched the slow march to the bin. He had observed how the handkerchief moved, how the fingers folded the photo again with military neatness. And now he watched the man's hands rest, not in defeat, but in preservation. On Rivers' lap, his own leather binder sat unopened. He'd brought it as cover, but now it didn't feel right to disturb it. Instead, he reached slowly into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. A tap, then another. He opened a protected folder. Digital scans of long classified deployment rosters, now declassified under his review authority. He searched one word, Alpha 5. The system spun. A moment passed. Then, one match. The document was aged, even in its digitized form. A black and white roster, grainy. The signature on the bottom flickered. A colonel's stamp, half legible, half ghosted. In the column marked Forward Operatives, 1971-72 was the name. Commander Henry Collins. Status, injured, recovered. Record, eyes only. Rivers exhaled once through his nose, slowly. He looked up again, this time not just watching, but seeing. He traced the outline of the cane, the shape of the folder's corner, the photo that peeked beneath a creased envelope. His fingers moved to the corner of his phone screen. He activated a line. Secure, routed through the Pentagon's internal network. I have visual confirmation, he said quietly. Hank Collins, Unit Alpha 5. Confirm status as operational in post-SEAL activity. Cross-reference mission, Echo Low, 52B. The voice on the other end responded. That op was redacted. I know, Rivers said, but the man's right here, and they just called his ID a lie. There was a pause, then the reply. Understood. Authorize validation. Rivers ended the call and tucked the phone away. His hands returned to his lap, but now his posture changed. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just grounded, ready. The waiting room remained unaware of the storm that had just passed invisibly through its airwaves. A mother rocked a stroller slowly by the corner. The clerk at window 4 continued typing with nervous fingers. The ticket machine chirped out another number, unheard. But Hank shifted again. Not to look, just to breathe. The colonel stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just the slow rise of a man who no longer needed to sit. He took 3 steps forward, the sound of his boots swallowed by the fabric-covered floor. Then he stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes scanned the counter, the ID, the clock, then Hank. He adjusted his coat, smoothed the edge of his sleeve. The room had not yet noticed him, but that would change soon. Sometimes authority doesn't need to speak, it just needs to stand. The hush that preceded Colonel Rivers' movement felt like the softest pull of wind before a flag is raised. One by one, the sounds of the government office seemed to fall away. The printer's hum, the creak of pleather chairs, the high-pitched beep of someone's number being called. None of it mattered now. All eyes turned slowly, subtly, not by command, but by instinct. They followed the shift in the room's gravity as Rivers approached the counter. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The clerk, who had just minutes earlier slammed an accusation across the desk, paused mid-keystroke. Her lips parted slightly. Her breath caught in the throat. Something about this man made her spine straighten, made her glance nervously toward the edge of the ID card she had pushed aside. Colonel Rivers took the last few steps with calm resolve, his gait steady, boots silent, but purposeful. He didn't reach for a badge or bark his name. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the counter, beside the frayed sleeve of Henry Collins' military ID. His fingers hovered a moment, then, with care, he picked up the card, holding it between thumb and forefinger, as if it were a piece of fragile history. The silence in the room deepened. He turned to Hank, who was still seated, posture composed, folder now closed neatly on his lap. Rivers bent slightly at the knee, not to kneel, not quite, but enough to meet Hank eye to eye. For a long second, they said nothing. Then Rivers held out the card. "With all due respect, sir," he said, voice low and steady. "To me, "You're still Commander Collins." The room didn't gasp. There was no dramatic swell, but something invisible broke, a tension that had held everyone tight. Several people shifted in their seats. The clerk behind the glass window blinked slowly, as if unsure of what she'd just heard. Henry didn't reach out immediately. He looked at the man before him. He studied the shoulders, the crease of the collar, the slight fading of a tan line at the wrist, all the marks of someone who had worn a uniform long enough to never fully remove it. Then, slowly, with hands that had once steered convoys through jungle mud and airlifted wounded through monsoon fog, he reached forward and accepted the card. He didn't thank him, not because he was ungrateful, but because words would have cheapened the moment. Rivers rose and faced the counter. His tone remained even. "I am Colonel Mark Rivers, Office of Personnel Integrity, Department of Defense. This man's credentials are not only valid, they are beyond reproach. His unit operated under sealed authority, and his records were officially blacked out for national security reasons. That does not make him a liar. That makes him a survivor of an era where some wars were fought in silence." The clerk's hands began to tremble. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Rivers continued, not loud, not confrontational, simply factual. "Your database will not reflect his mission records, because your database does not go as far back as the dirt roads he walked to extract his injured. He was there. I have verified it personally." A murmur now stirred in the room. One man lowered his phone. Another, wearing a blue jacket and sitting by the wall, stood slowly, his head nodding once toward Hank, eyes soft. No one clapped. No one needed to. Rivers turned again to Hank. He gave a sharp, crisp salute, not theatrical, not overdrawn, just enough to remind everyone that tradition still carried weight. That honor, when shown properly, could fill a room like sunlight breaking through years of gray. Hank hesitated, then slowly, without leaning on his cane, brought his hand up in return. The salute was not flawless, but it was full, and for the first time in the long morning, his eyes held something close to peace. Behind the glass, the clerk took a small, stunned step backward. The man in the blue jacket said softly, "That's the first time I've seen a real salute in this place." Rivers turned back to the counter. "This office will acknowledge the error and correct his file, immediately. And from this moment forward, you will address him with the rank he earned. That is Commander Collins. You understand?" The clerk nodded once. Her eyes didn't meet his. Hank did not gloat. He did not grin. He simply stood, slowly, methodically, his hand resting again on the folder that now bore no question. The waiting room had shifted, and though the chairs, the lights, and the walls remained the same, the air had changed. It now carried the weight of truth. For several long moments, no one spoke. There was no applause, no spontaneous cheers, only the soft hum of the overhead lights and the mechanical groan of an old printer in the back corner, now suddenly sounding distant, unimportant. Colonel Rivers remained where he stood, posture calm, feet planted, arms by his side. He didn't bask in what had just occurred. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. His eyes remained fixed on the man before him, not in pity, not in reverence, but with the unspoken language only soldiers shared. Henry Collins stood taller now, though the weight of his cane still pressed against his palm. His shoulders, once drawn, had relaxed by degrees. The folder in his arm didn't seem so heavy anymore. His gaze lifted and met the colonel's. They said nothing, but in that quiet exchange, something old stirred. The echo of fire bases lost to time, of coded radios crackling in darkness, of orders issued with only seconds to think and lives depending on the breath between words. It was not friendship that passed between them, nor obligation. It was recognition. Across the room, the subtle shift had grown more visible. A younger man near the intake window, perhaps late 20s, looked down at his own phone before locking the screen and pocketing it, ashamed of having even thought to film it. A woman in business attire stepped aside from the line and returned to her seat without a word. A middle-aged man in a veteran's ball cap adjusted it slightly, then lowered his eyes, whispering something no one could hear. The clerk, still seated behind the glass barrier, tapped lightly at her keyboard, but her hands no longer moved with certainty. She reached for a printed form but paused, as if the paper itself now bore more weight than she was trained to handle. Another worker, an older gentleman with silver hair at the neighboring desk, gently laid his hand over hers and took the form. Without making a scene, he quietly took over. Colonel Rivers gave a final nod and stepped aside, but before moving away, he looked once more to Hank. His voice, quieter now, was meant only for him. Mission 52B, Night Drop, Southern Quadrant. You held your ground for 6 hours without support. Hank's fingers tensed slightly on the edge of his folder, but he gave no audible reply. His head tilted by the slightest degree, an acknowledgement, not of pride, but of memory, of the price behind those numbers. Rivers looked down. Your transmission was the last one my father ever heard before they pulled out. You gave them coordinates. My father made it out because of that. Hank's breath caught. His lips parted slightly, but still no words. He looked beyond Rivers now, past the desk, past the row of waiting chairs, past the posters on the wall warning about fraud and delays. His eyes softened, then narrowed just a touch. A memory surfaced. I remember, Hank said, voice gravel thin but steady. Your father carried a photo, little boy in it, kept it tucked into the strap of his M16. He said he wanted to live long enough to see that smile in person. Rivers' mouth twitched. He blinked once. He did. That boy was me. Neither man moved for several seconds. Then finally, Colonel Rivers took a quiet breath and placed a single hand over his heart. Not a salute, not a gesture of ceremony, but of respect. Hank nodded once in return, more slowly this time. Not in agreement, but in something deeper. The kind of acknowledgement you give only when someone has seen through all the camouflage time has tried to bury you beneath. Behind them, the waiting room had forgotten why it was there. Numbers remained frozen on the electronic display. No one approached the front desk. People just watched. Not out of curiosity anymore, but reverence. Something rare had happened. Something unplanned, unforced. From the far left, the man in the veteran's ball cap stood and stepped forward. He didn't speak. He simply walked over, slowly, to where Hank still stood beside his chair, and gave a small nod. It wasn't the kind of nod people give to celebrities. It was the kind that said, I see you, I believe you, I would follow you. A young woman near the corner, likely waiting for her student loan form, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin from her purse. Her expression wasn't pity, it was gratitude. The kind that comes when something invisible is suddenly revealed and honored. Rivers stepped away, giving Hank room, but Hank didn't sit. He stood with his documents in hand, eyes sweeping across the room. He didn't look smug. He didn't look victorious. He looked restored. A chair squeaked as someone stood, then another. One by one, not in unison but by silent agreement, people began to rise from their seats. They didn't applaud. They didn't speak. They just stood. Hank took it in for a moment, then finally returned to his seat. He didn't lean back. He remained upright. The folder sat gently in his lap. The ID card, the one once called a fake, now rested on top. Not hidden, not clutched, just resting. Clean, whole, seen. The silence in the waiting room lingered. Not the kind that asks for words, but the kind that honors what has already been said without speaking. Hank Collins adjusted the folder in his lap. His fingers moved slower now, not from hesitation, but from the weight of memory stirring to the surface. He looked down at the ID card still resting on top. The edges were frayed, the lamination bubbled at the corners, and one side had a hairline crack through the printed name. Still, it sat with quiet authority. Colonel Rivers moved closer again, crouching slightly to speak at eye level. There was no sense of command in his tone, only the cadence of a man finally stepping into truth. He gestured lightly to the old photograph Hank had placed earlier on the counter. The image had faded with time, but the uniforms, the grit in the faces, and the distinct terrain behind them remained. "This photo," Rivers said gently. "That's Camp Osiris, isn't it? Sector Kilo, south of the ridgeline." Hank's brow lifted, only slightly. "That's right. Middle of the monsoon season. Mud so thick we lost a jeep in it." The corner of Rivers' mouth twitched. Not a smile, but recognition. "We had to evac with choppers, low flying. There were no roads by then." Hank nodded slowly, fingers now tracing the grain of the paper, not looking at it, just remembering. 52 Bravo, he said, voice nearly a whisper. "We weren't supposed to be there. They called us ghosts in the briefings. Said if we were caught, no one would know our names." The colonel let that sit for a moment, then leaned closer. "But I remember your name. We all did. You were the one who went back when the evac countdown was already on 0. Brought 3 men out of that crash zone. We heard the fire through the headset. There was a flicker in Hank's eye. Not pride, not nostalgia. Something quieter. A long-held burden briefly set down. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," Hank murmured. "I was just the only one left who could carry." Rivers nodded, not interrupting. Hank looked up, more directly now. "They told us afterward our records would be sealed. Said our mission didn't officially exist. We'd be listed under inactive duty with discretionary detail gaps. Administrative blackout protocol, they called it." Rivers looked toward the clerk's desk, where the woman who had first challenged Hank now stood motionless, her arms crossed, not in defiance, but in folded shame. Her eyes were locked on the documents before her, though she no longer seemed to be reading. "They buried us under bureaucracy," Hank continued, his voice still calm but firm. "Most of us didn't mind. We weren't in it for recognition. But over the years, when you need to prove who you are to get health care, to get your pension, your benefits, and all you have is a whisper of your own name." He paused, breathing through his nose. "It starts to feel like maybe you never existed." Rivers stood again. "You did. You do." He turned to the counter, facing the gathered staff and public. His voice now carried, not through volume, but through unmistakable authority. "This man's record may not exist in your system, but I flew alongside him. I monitored his coordinates. I heard his voice when mine was shaking. He pulled men out of fire, out of mud, out of death. And he came home to silence." The second clerk, the older man who had taken over the desk earlier, now moved forward. He didn't speak. He simply opened the folder again, carefully this time. He examined the letters, the photograph, the orders stamped restricted. There was reverence in the way he handled them, the same way a chaplain might handle a folded flag. Hank reached forward slowly and took out a folded page. It was brittle, creased in 4. As he unfolded it, the paper rustled like old leaves. On it, typed faintly, was a mission number, a name, and a line of coordinates, but no signature. "This is all they gave me," he said. "No medals, no citation. Just this page and a nod in a hallway." Rivers glanced at it, eyes narrowing slightly. "That's a recognition dispatch, level Delta. That means you were unofficially commended, but barred from public award due to operational sensitivity." Hank gave a small shrug. "Never mattered to me. I kept the paper, though. Something to remind me I wasn't making it all up." Someone at the far end of the room, the young man who'd earlier looked dismissive, took off his hat and held it against his chest. His face had gone pale. The silence returned, heavier now, but no longer oppressive. It was the silence that follows understanding, the kind that settles in when a truth, long buried, has been finally spoken. Colonel Rivers stepped forward, the weight of Hank's words still hanging like smoke in the air. The man no longer stood as a quiet observer. Now he was a witness, a bearer of truth, and a soldier repaying a quiet debt. His gaze moved across the office, from the pale clerk at the desk, to the silent officials by the doorway, to the handful of civilians who had arrived merely to renew forms or verify signatures, but now sat still as pews in a chapel. Without asking, Rivers extended a hand and lifted the page from Hank's folder, the brittle dispatch with the typewritten coordinates. Holding it up gently, he turned to the room. "This document, he said slowly. Might look like just another form. But for those who understand its origin, it is a battlefield cross made of paper. Level Delta means a man was recognized for valor and then erased from the record to protect the mission. He walked the paper to the front desk and laid it down like an offering. The younger official looked at it, then back up at the colonel, as if unsure whether she was allowed to touch it. "I am requesting," Rivers said, his voice even, "an immediate update to this office's policy. Effective today, any veteran whose records fall into Black Ops classifications, restricted service assignments, or sealed deployments will be processed with provisional verification. We will honor corroborated testimony from qualified command, like mine, and cease requiring these men to relive their wars just to be heard." There was no applause, no swell of music, but the room stirred, shoulders relaxed, eyes lifted. The silence cracked, not into sound, but into clarity. He turned slightly, addressing the clerks without animosity. "You didn't know, now you do. Don't forget again." The older male clerk nodded slowly and opened a fresh manila folder. "We'll begin the re-entry of records now," he murmured. "Commander Collins, if you'll please." The title landed like a dropped stone. Commander, not sir, not mister, not alleged. Hank looked up, startled for only a second. Then he stood, not fast, but tall. He approached the desk. His cane tapped twice on the tile, then stopped. The same worn ID card, now retrieved, smoothed, and honored, was passed back to him with both hands. The young woman who had challenged him didn't speak, but her hands trembled slightly as she did it. A shift had occurred. Not guilt, not pity, awareness. Rivers moved to the bulletin board at the front of the room. He unclipped a laminated notice and replaced it with a new one, typed, signed, and sealed. The sign read, "New Veteran Verification Policy. Classified service shall be respected. Provisional recognition authorized on testimony and command endorsement." Someone near the entrance reached for their phone, not to call or complain, but to photograph the notice. A moment later, another did the same. Rivers stepped back, then turned to Hank. "Commander, this is your building now. The rest of us just work here." A moment passed, then another. A man seated by the window stood. Middle-aged, blue denim shirt, quiet eyes. He raised his right hand to his brow, a proper salute, nothing showy. Then he held it, waiting. One by one, others followed. Not every person, but enough. A nod here, a quiet gesture there. A woman placed her hand on her heart. Another man removed his cap. And then, as if it had always been meant to be this way, Hank returned the salute. No longer a figure slumped under bureaucracy. Now he stood firm, a commander once again. The following Thursday, just before the morning rush, the lobby of the same federal building stirred with a different kind of movement. Fluorescent lights flickered on as always, coffee brewed behind the intake counter as always, and the security scanner gave its routine series of beeps. But something invisible had shifted. A thread of quiet anticipation that ran through the place like a note before a hymn. At precisely 7:58 a.m., the front doors parted for Henry "Hank" Collins. The air outside still held autumn's chill, and as he entered, he wore the same heavy coat from last week, the same flat cap pulled just above his brow, and the same time-worn folder under his arm. Edges no longer frayed, but pressed flat with care. His cane tapped once, then twice against the tile. He paused inside the doorway, not hesitating, just noticing. At the main desk, the clerk who once questioned him was already standing. Her hair was neatly pulled back, and in her expression there was no trace of false reverence, only something measured and quiet. She nodded toward him. "Good morning, Commander Collins," she said, the words not forced, but placed gently. Her voice didn't carry across the room. It didn't need to. Hank returned the nod and stepped forward. The floor felt the same beneath his boots. Scuffed, institutional tile. But the silence was different. Eyes weren't prying anymore. They were watchful in a new way. respectful without spectacle. A young man with a notepad seated by the entrance stood as Hank passed. He didn't speak. He simply adjusted the patch on his chest. It read, in subdued font, "Vet Ally." Hank noticed it. He didn't comment, but he paused a beat longer than usual. That was acknowledgement enough. On the wall near the service window, the new policy plaque had been reframed. Not bigger, not grander, just cleaner. Beneath the words, "Classified veterans deserve verification and dignity," a small brass plate had been affixed. This change was born from the testimony of Commander Henry Collins. Hank's folder remained tucked against his side, though the papers inside had not changed. They didn't need to. But the difference now was that no one asked him to explain them. The proof had become the man himself. At window 2, a younger clerk, perhaps no older than Hank's grandchildren, had set aside an open chair. She gestured to it when she saw him. "Whenever you're ready, sir," she said. Her tone wasn't performative. It was prepared. Hank gave her a brief smile, a full one this time, and lowered himself into the chair with the slow, firm grace of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to continue. Behind him, a few new veterans had arrived. One of them, still figuring out which line to stand in, held an envelope filled with service forms, creased, incomplete, confused. He caught Hank's eye and hesitated. Hank leaned slightly, motioned him over without speaking. They sat together for several minutes. Nothing official, just a quiet moment of orientation. Hank pulled a paper from his folder and showed the young man where to highlight discharge codes, how to reference restricted operations, and which boxes to leave blank. No condescension, just command transferred in peacetime. Outside, the wind stirred the American flag atop the building. It flapped high and clean against a pale October sky. Inside, no ceremony had been planned, and yet something ceremonial lived in every movement. The way the clerk placed a coaster for his coffee without being asked. The way a woman from across the room brought him a pen she thought he might prefer. The way another clerk, the one who once dismissed him, now watched and waited, not in fear, but in a kind of reverent curiosity, still learning. When his appointment ended, Hank did not rush to leave. He stood slowly, adjusted the coat across his shoulders, and looked once more at the new policy placard. His eyes didn't linger on his own name. Instead, he scanned the phrase, "Testimony and Command Endorsement," and gave a single nod. Behind him, a voice called out softly, not loudly enough to disturb the lobby, but clearly enough to reach. "Thank you for returning, Commander." He turned. It was Colonel Rivers in civilian dress, hands behind his back. His presence was calm, unannounced, but deeply felt. He didn't offer another salute, just a shared glance, a final understanding. Then Hank stepped forward, passed through the doors once more, and disappeared into the light. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this reminded you of someone you still carry in memory. The best way to honor their legacy is to keep listening. Click on the next suggested video, and we'll walk together through another quiet, powerful chapter of courage, sacrifice, and dignity.